Well, I argue that there's a revival of the notion of ontology, although in a very different way than it was understood traditionally, which comes from Emerson Hall, from this building in which we're talking, from my late colleague, Willard Van Orman Quine. And he combined two doctrines which have come, which at least one of which attracted me a lot, but which I now think have had a bad influence on metaphysics. The Quine, of course, the question of ontology in its simplest form is, what is there in the world? And the Greeks had a special term for these things of which the world consists. They call them substances, meaning not like lead, gold, and so on. You and I are substances in this traditional Greek sense. And so what are the substances of which the world consists was a traditional question. So one might say, roughly, what things does the world consist of? But then Quine broadened it by arguing that whenever you use a word like every or all, if you say some day, there are some rainy days this month, you have prima facie committed yourself to an object or entity. If I say some numbers are greater than 1 million, I've committed myself. Committed was his expression, sometimes called ontological commitment. I've committed myself to the existence of abstract entities. Unless you can somehow paraphrase, say, well, I agree it looks as if I've committed myself, but really I can paraphrase that away. So this led to the idea of looking at our language to see what we're ontologically committed to. But a second doctrine of Quine's, which went to is that since he did not want to end up saying, well, we're committed to rainy days, we're committed to recessions, we're committed to inflations, we're committed to psychological crises, we're committed to inferior writing, all the things we use the word some and all and every in connection with are called, we're said to quantify over, a term Quine invented. So Quine said, no, we're not really committed to the existence of all these things we quantify over. Really, all we need to take serious is science. And by science, he meant science as rewritten in the vocabulary of mathematical logic. Now, that had a little to do, I would say, with Quine's age, with his chronological period. He was born in 1908. So he lived when mathematical logic was a very young subject. And Principia Mathematica, I think the second volume came out probably when Quine was about 11. And so the excitement of mathematical logic, this idea that you can find out what there is by taking the best science and then rewriting it, not necessarily in the notation of Principia Mathematica, because Quine invented his own set theory, but in terms of the best symbolic logic. So there's this dream, which in a way started analytic philosophy going, that the new subject of mathematical logic would be the key to solving philosophical problems. But taken together, those two doctrines, what exists as far as we can tell, because science will change its mind, and we know that, but as far as we can tell, what exists or what we should bet on is what science says exists, and science came more and more to mean for Quine just physics, and physics rewritten in the language of mathematical logic. That, I think, leads to a kind of science worship, which I think has harmed the subject. And then the problem is, but if you say that, for example, and for Quine, the problem is Quine would have been happy as a kind of materialist if you could say all that exists is physical objects. But he recognized that physics uses a lot of mathematics, and mathematics, he said, quantifies over abstract entities like numbers and sets. So we're committed by the best science to the existence of these causally inert abstract entities. So he called himself for that reason a reluctant Platonist. Plato was right, there are non-physical entities, but we only believe in them because science needs them. And then in ethics, of course, the parallel problem was that G.E. Moore argued that the property of being good could not be identified with what Moore called a natural property, like being electrically charged, say. And so it must be a non-natural property. And so in both these two fields, mathematics and ethics, different philosophers thought that we're committed to the existence of invisible, causally inert, mysterious objects. And I don't think that's right in either case. I think we got led by a plausible line of reasoning into a very crazy alley, an alley we better get out of before night falls.